If love ever leaves footprints, it begins with the ones too small for the world to notice. The nursery doors stood open, swaying gently as icy wind slipped through the silent halls of Blackwood Palace, carrying scattered snowflakes across the polished stone floor. 3 tiny beds, each carved from ancient white oak and wrapped in thick wool blankets, sat empty beneath the pale glow of dawn. The little wooden wolf toys remained where they had been abandoned the night before. A small blue blanket had fallen onto the floor, its corner still clutched around the stuffed fox one of the pups refused to sleep without. The silence felt impossible. Every servant in the palace knew the Alpha King's children greeted each sunrise with laughter, soft growls, and racing paws echoing through the corridors. This morning, there was nothing. Ethan Blackwood stood motionless in the center of the room. He did not raise his voice. He did not bark commands. His silver eyes simply moved from one empty bed to the next, absorbing every tiny detail with terrifying focus. The fireplace had burned low during the night. One bedroom window had been left cracked open just enough for winter air to sneak inside. Below it, almost hidden against the dark stone floor, tiny muddy paw prints wandered toward the open window before disappearing into the snowy world beyond. Captain Brooks lowered his head. "Your Majesty, we've searched every hallway." Ethan said nothing. Behind him, dozens of palace guards waited without daring to breathe too loudly. The entire fortress had already awakened before sunrise. Messengers rode through neighboring territories. Patrols searched every road leading away from the palace. Hunters examined every trail through Blackwood Forest. No one had found the 3 missing wolf pups. Ethan slowly knelt beside the window. His gloved fingers brushed lightly against one tiny print pressed into melting snow along the stone ledge. The tracks were uneven, playful instead of frightened. They wandered instead of running. His eyes narrowed. They hadn't fled from danger. They had followed curiosity. Outside, winter had covered the kingdom beneath nearly 8 inches of fresh snow. Pine trees stood silent beneath heavy white branches while soft morning light painted the forest in shades of silver and blue. Most people would have seen only endless snow. Ethan saw a story. 3 sets of tiny paw prints crossed the frozen courtyard together before slipping beneath the old iron fence surrounding the royal gardens. One set stopped for a moment beside a rabbit track before continuing after the others. The smallest pup had paused to investigate the world. Ethan almost smiled before concern returned to his face. "No horses," he finally said, his calm voice carrying across the frozen courtyard. Every guard immediately looked confused. "Your Majesty?" Captain Brooks asked carefully. Ethan stood and fastened the dark cloak across his shoulders. "Horses destroy tracks." Without waiting for another word, he stepped beyond the palace gates alone. Behind him, the guards exchanged uncertain glances before following on foot several yards behind their king. They understood something few outsiders ever realized. Ethan Blackwood trusted almost nothing except evidence placed before his own eyes. The tiny paw prints continued through untouched snow, weaving between ancient pine trees where sunlight barely reached the forest floor. Occasionally, one pup slipped, leaving little marks where playful paws scrambled back upright. Ethan noticed every detail. They had not been chased. They had not scattered. They had stayed together the entire journey. Nearly 2 miles passed before another set of tracks quietly appeared beside theirs. Human footprints. Small, light, steady, not hunting them, walking with them. Ethan slowed. The stranger's footprints never stepped over the pups. Instead, they curved gently around them, as though making room for tiny legs struggling through deep snow. One place revealed something even stranger. 4 sets of prints disappeared completely. Only one remained. Ethan knelt once more. The snow beneath the single trail pressed deeper than before. Someone had carried them. He lifted his gaze toward a faint ribbon of smoke rising beyond the trees. Hidden between towering pines, almost swallowed by winter itself, stood a weathered little cabin with warm light glowing softly behind frost-covered windows. Ethan's heartbeat slowed as he noticed something no warrior would have expected. Tiny paw prints ended at the front porch. None of them came back out. The cabin looked as though winter itself had forgotten it. Snow rested quietly across the sagging roof, and a narrow trail of smoke drifted from the stone chimney into the pale morning sky. Ethan remained hidden among the pines, his sharp eyes studying every detail before taking another step. The tiny front porch had been swept clean except for 3 sets of little paw prints circling excitedly around the wooden rocking chair before disappearing beneath the door. Whoever lived here had not tried to erase them. Whoever lived here had simply welcomed them inside. A faint scent reached him on the cold breeze. Fresh bread, pine wood, chamomile tea, and something else. Warmth. Not the warmth of fire alone, but the unmistakable feeling of a place where fear did not belong. Captain Brooks quietly approached from behind. "Should we surround the cabin, Your Majesty?" Ethan never looked away from the small home. "No, we still do not know who lives here." Ethan's answer remained calm. "Exactly." The captain hesitated before stepping back. No one questioned the Alpha King twice. Inside the cabin, Amelia Brooks stirred the thick vegetable soup simmering above the fireplace, while soft morning sunlight slipped through frost-covered windows. The room was small enough that every corner carried the comforting scent of cedar wood and fresh herbs hanging from ceiling beams. Shelves lined the walls, crowded with carefully repaired books, handmade blankets, jars of dried berries, and tiny carved wooden animals she had made during long winter evenings. Nothing expensive filled the cabin. Everything carried signs of patient hands. Amelia smiled as a tiny gray wolf pup clumsily wandered into the kitchen, its oversized paws sliding across the polished wooden floor. "Good morning, sleepy one," she whispered. The little pup blinked up at her before giving a tiny yawn that seemed much larger than its body. Another pup followed only seconds later, carrying one of Amelia's wool socks proudly between its teeth as though it had discovered buried treasure. She laughed softly, kneeling to their level. So that is where it disappeared. The smallest pup finally emerged from beneath the table wrapped almost entirely inside one of her old quilts, dragging the blanket behind like a royal cape. Amelia could not help smiling wider. Yesterday evening they had arrived exhausted, soaked by melting snow, their little bodies trembling with hunger and cold. She had not asked where they came from. She had not wondered whether someone important might be searching for them. She had simply filled a bucket with warm water, carefully cleaned pine needles and mud from their soft fur, wrapped each one inside thick towels, and fed them every scrap of food remaining in her pantry. Her own dinner had quietly become theirs. She had gone to bed with only a cup of tea, but she had never once regretted the choice. The gray pup padded over to the fireplace where a basket filled with folded towels rested nearby. Amelia reached down and gently checked its tiny paw. "Much better," she whispered after seeing the small thorn she had removed the night before had left no swelling. "You are brave." The little wolf responded by pressing its forehead against her hand before happily trotting away again. She had always possessed that unusual gift. Animals trusted her almost immediately. Injured birds rested calmly in her palms. Stray deer approached without fear. Even frightened horses became peaceful after hearing her voice. The neighbors used to joke that the forest borrowed her heart whenever it needed kindness. Amelia had never believed she was special. She simply listened before she acted. Outside, Ethan slowly circled the cabin until he reached one frost-covered window. He stopped without making a sound. Through the delicate patterns of ice upon the glass, he caught his first clear glimpse inside. One of the pups rolled happily onto its back, while Amelia gently brushed loose snow from its thick silver fur with an old wooden brush. Another stood on its hind legs, trying very seriously to steal a fresh biscuit cooling beside the stove. The smallest one sat patiently at Amelia's feet, staring up at her with complete trust while she tied a tiny blue ribbon around its neck after discovering it tangled inside her sewing basket. Ethan did not move. The ribbons matched nothing of royal tradition. They carried no crest, no symbol of rank. They had simply been chosen because they looked cheerful against snowy white fur. Amelia placed 3 little bowls on the floor before stepping back. "Careful," she reminded gently. "No racing." The warning lasted less than 2 seconds before all 3 pups hurried toward breakfast together with excited little barks that filled the cabin with joyful chaos. Amelia covered her mouth, trying unsuccessfully to hide another laugh. Ethan had spent years watching diplomats disguise their intentions behind polished smiles. He had seen warriors fake loyalty, nobles rehearse kindness, and rivals perform generosity whenever the throne was watching. This looked nothing like performance. No audience stood inside that cabin. No reward waited beyond those walls. There was only a lonely Omega who believed 3 hungry little wolves deserved warmth before asking any questions. And for reasons Ethan could not explain, something deep inside his guarded heart became very, very quiet. The morning drifted quietly across the clearing as though time itself had slowed to watch the little cabin breathe. Snow slid gently from the pine branches outside, landing with soft whispers that never disturbed the peaceful rhythm within. Amelia opened the front door just long enough to shake crumbs onto the porch for the winter birds. Before she could step back inside, 3 fluffy wolves squeezed between her boots and bounced into the fresh snow with fearless excitement. "Do not go too far," she called after them with a smile that carried far more hope than authority. The largest pup immediately buried its nose beneath the powder, searching for something fascinating hidden below, while the second chased fluttering snowflakes, as though every crystal were alive. The smallest stopped halfway across the yard before turning around to make certain Amelia was still standing in the doorway. Only after she nodded did the tiny wolf continue exploring. Ethan watched from behind a thick pine tree, remaining perfectly still. He noticed the smallest detail. None of the pups wandered beyond where they could still see the cabin. They had freedom, yet they chose to remain close to the woman who had offered them warmth. It was not obedience. It was trust. Captain Brooks quietly stepped beside him once more. "Your Majesty, should we announce ourselves now?" Ethan slowly shook his head. "Not yet. The young heirs have been missing since midnight." Ethan kept watching as Amelia knelt to repair a tiny snowman the smallest pup had accidentally knocked over with its oversized paws. "They are no longer missing," he answered softly. "They know exactly where they are." The captain fell silent again. He had served Ethan for nearly 15 years and recognized the thoughtful expression crossing the Alpha King's face. It was the same look Ethan wore whenever he encountered something that challenged everything he believed he understood. Amelia gathered a basket beneath one arm and walked toward the edge of the clearing where evergreen bushes still held bright winter berries. The 3 pups followed her like eager little shadows. Every few steps one of them would stop to investigate a pine cone or leap clumsily over a fallen log before racing to catch up again. Amelia never hurried them. She simply waited, smiling each time tiny paws came bounding back through the snow. At the berry bushes, she carefully brushed away the snow and picked only the ripest fruit. "The birds need these too," she reminded her little companions. "We only take what we need." The largest pup tilted its head as though listening with complete seriousness before gently dropping a berry it had been carrying back onto the branch. Amelia laughed softly. Exactly. Ethan almost forgot to breathe. His children had been surrounded their entire lives by servants eager to impress the royal family with perfect manners and polished lessons. Yet no carefully planned lecture had ever taught them generosity as naturally as one simple sentence spoken beside a berry bush. As the basket slowly filled, Amelia noticed tiny paw prints leading toward a frozen stream. She frowned slightly. "No." Her gentle voice remained calm, yet every pup stopped immediately. She walked over and crouched beside the thin layer of ice covering the narrow water. "It looks strong," she explained while lightly touching the surface with a small stick. The ice cracked almost instantly. Sometimes the prettiest things are not the safest. The smallest pup quietly backed away before pressing against her leg. Amelia stroked its soft head. "That is a wise decision." Hidden among the trees, Ethan closed his eyes for only a moment. She had protected them without frightening them. She had corrected them without raising her voice. She had earned their trust without demanding it. The realization settled deep inside him with unexpected weight. Back at the cabin, Amelia poured warm water into a wooden basin near the fireplace and gently wiped muddy snow from each tiny paw before drying them with thick towels. The pups accepted every bit of care without resistance. One rested its chin on her shoulder while another curled against her knees, growing sleepier with every passing minute. The smallest struggled to keep its bright eyes open before finally surrendering to a wide yawn that made Amelia smile again. "Someone has had a very adventurous morning," she whispered. She spread a large knitted blanket across the rug beside the fire. One by one the pups settled onto its soft folds. The largest stretched with a satisfied sigh before lying across the edge as though standing guard. The second circled 3 careful times before collapsing beside its sibling. The smallest climbed awkwardly into Amelia's lap, rested its tiny head against her sweater, and drifted asleep within seconds. Amelia leaned back in the old rocking chair without disturbing the little wolf. She reached for the book resting beside her and quietly turned the first page, reading aloud in the same gentle voice she always used whenever the cabin felt lonely. She never noticed the shadows standing beyond the frosted window. Ethan remained outside, watching the impossible scene unfold before him. 3 royal heirs who usually filled the palace with endless energy now slept more peacefully than he had seen in months, their breathing slow and even beneath the glow of the fire. They had not chosen silk beds or royal comforts. They had chosen kindness. And as Amelia continued reading to 3 sleeping wolves who could no longer hear the words, Ethan realized something that no royal advisor, elder, or scholar had ever been able to teach him. Home was never built from stone walls or golden crowns. Sometimes it began with a single warm voice willing to read one more page simply because someone nearby might sleep a little better. Afternoon light settled softly across the clearing, turning the untouched snow into a sea of sparkling silver, while gentle smoke continued to curl above the little cabin. Inside, the fire crackled with steady warmth as Amelia carefully folded freshly washed towels and placed them beside the hearth. Every few moments, she glanced toward the blanket where the 3 little wolves still slept, their tiny sides rising and falling in peaceful rhythm. She smiled to herself. They looked as though they had never known fear. The smallest pup stirred first, stretching its front paws before opening bright, sleepy eyes. It immediately searched the room until it found Amelia standing beside the window. Only then did its tail begin wagging against the blanket. The other 2 woke seconds later and hurried across the floor, surrounding her with happy little circles until she laughed and lowered herself onto one knee. "Someone is feeling much better today," she whispered while gently scratching behind one fluffy ear. The largest pup proudly nudged a carved wooden ball across the floor with its nose. Amelia rolled it back, and within moments all 3 were chasing it across the tiny room with clumsy determination. Their joyful play filled every corner of the cabin with life that had been missing for far too long. Outside, Ethan remained hidden among the towering pines, his eyes never leaving the small home. He had intended to reveal himself hours ago. Instead, every passing moment made him hesitate for reasons he could not fully explain. Captain Brooks quietly approached once again, lowering his voice almost to a whisper. "The council will soon learn where the heirs are, Your Majesty. They will expect immediate action." Ethan nodded without looking away from the cabin. "I know. If they send additional guards." Ethan finally turned toward him. "Then they will remain at the edge of the forest until I say otherwise." The captain recognized the unmistakable finality in those words. No soldier would cross that clearing without the Alpha King's permission. Ethan returned his attention to the cabin window. He had commanded armies across frozen mountains. He had negotiated peace between rival packs that had hated one another for generations. Yet somehow stepping onto that little porch felt more complicated than facing any battlefield he had ever known. He feared only one thing: that the peaceful expressions on his children's faces might disappear the instant strangers entered their sanctuary. Inside, Amelia hung a fresh pot above the fire and quietly stirred a simple stew made from potatoes, carrots, onions, and herbs gathered before the first snowfall. It was humble food, but the comforting aroma quickly filled the room. The largest pup wandered into the kitchen and sat politely beside her feet. Amelia looked down with amused surprise. "Already hungry again?" she asked. The tiny wolf answered with an innocent blink that made her laugh. She tore off a small piece of warm bread and waited until all 3 pups sat together before offering each the same amount. "Everyone shares," she reminded them softly. None of them tried taking more than their portion. Ethan watched in thoughtful silence. Even palace tutors had struggled to teach patience to energetic young wolves born into endless privilege. Amelia had done it with kindness instead of commands. A sudden breeze drifted through the forest, carrying the familiar scent of Ethan toward the cabin. The smallest pup froze. Its ears lifted high before it hurried to the front window, placing both tiny paws against the glass. The other 2 quickly joined it. Amelia noticed their sudden excitement and walked over with quiet curiosity. "What is it?" she asked, peering through the frosted pane. She saw only snowy trees swaying gently beneath the pale afternoon sky. The pups continued wagging their tails, little noses pressing eagerly against the glass. Ethan remained perfectly still behind the nearest pine. Every instinct told him they had recognized his scent. One soft whine escaped the smallest pup before it looked back toward Amelia, as though asking permission. She smiled gently and opened the front door. Cold winter air slipped inside as the three little wolves bounded happily onto the porch. Amelia wrapped her wool shawl around her shoulders before following them outside. The pups stopped only a few feet from the steps, staring into the quiet forest with hopeful eyes. Amelia looked in the same direction, but still saw nothing except endless white snow between the trees. "Are you waiting for someone?" she asked quietly. Her voice floated across the clearing like a warm breeze. Ethan felt something unfamiliar tighten inside his chest. The children had sensed him long before their eyes could find him. They knew he was close. Yet none of them ran into the woods. Instead, all three remained beside Amelia, glancing back and forth between the forest and the woman who had cared for them, as though unwilling to leave either behind. Ethan understood the silent message immediately. They wanted both worlds to meet. For the first time since arriving at the cabin, the Alpha King stepped away from the shelter of the pine tree and slowly walked into the open snow, not as a ruler demanding answers, but as a father following the quiet trust his children had already chosen. Amelia instinctively rested one hand on the smallest pup as the tall stranger emerged from between the snow-covered pines, his long black cloak moving gently with the winter breeze. There was nothing hurried about his steps. He walked with quiet confidence, the kind that came from carrying responsibility instead of seeking attention. The afternoon sun reflected softly against his silver eyes, and for a brief moment Amelia understood why the little wolves had become so excited. They knew him. They had known he was there long before she ever sensed another presence in the forest. The three pups rushed across the snow, their joyful little barks filling the clearing as they surrounded the stranger's boots. The largest stood proudly on its hind legs, trying to reach his hand. The second circled him twice before rolling happily into the snow. The smallest leaned against his leg with a relieved sigh, so small it almost disappeared beneath the whispering wind. Ethan slowly knelt, his expression softening in a way very few people had ever witnessed. He gently rubbed behind one tiny ear before checking each little paw with careful fingers, making certain none of them carried fresh scratches from their unexpected adventure. The blue ribbons tied neatly around two fluffy necks immediately caught his attention. His eyes lingered there for several quiet seconds before lifting toward Amelia. Neither of them spoke. The silence carried no fear, only curiosity. Amelia studied the stranger standing before her. His clothes were finely tailored despite the snow dusting their edges. His posture was calm, but there was unmistakable authority in the way he carried himself. Even without recognizing his face, she sensed he was someone accustomed to protecting others. Ethan looked toward the cabin behind her. Through the open doorway, he noticed the folded blankets drying beside the fireplace, 3 tiny wooden bowls resting neatly on the table, and several damp towels hanging close to the warmth of the fire. A little wooden brush lay beside the hearth where Amelia had groomed the pups only moments earlier. Nothing inside that humble home had been arranged to impress a visitor. Every detail existed because someone had quietly cared for 3 little lives. "They found your home," Ethan finally said, his voice deep yet remarkably gentle. Amelia smiled with quiet embarrassment. "Actually, they found me." Ethan glanced back at the pups, who now sat happily between them as though introducing 2 old friends. "You did not know who they were." It was not a question. Amelia slowly shook her head. "No." She looked down at the smallest pup, now leaning comfortably against her boots. "I only knew they were cold." Ethan remained silent. Amelia continued without realizing how deeply every word reached him. "They were tired, hungry, and covered in snow." That seemed more important than asking where they came from. The forest itself appeared to grow quieter. Even Captain Brooks, still waiting respectfully among the distant trees with the other guards, lowered his eyes. Ethan looked around the clearing once more before speaking again. "You gave them your food." Amelia laughed softly as though the idea hardly deserved mentioning. "They needed it more than I did." "You washed them." She nodded. "They looked much happier afterward." "You stayed awake with them." Amelia hesitated before smiling again. The smallest one had a difficult time falling asleep. Reading usually helps frighten children. I hoped it might help frighten pups too. Ethan could not answer immediately. His children had slept peacefully for the first time in weeks beneath the care of someone who expected nothing in return. No reward, no recognition, no promise of favor, only kindness freely given. The largest pup suddenly trotted toward the cabin before returning with the little carved wooden ball clutched proudly in its mouth. It dropped the toy between Ethan and Amelia, looking from one to the other with bright, hopeful eyes. Amelia smiled. "I think someone wants us to play." Ethan looked at the tiny ball resting in the snow. Then, with unexpected ease, he gently rolled it toward the pups. All three bounded after it together, their delighted little growls echoing across the clearing. Amelia laughed, and for the first time Ethan heard the sound without the walls of the cabin surrounding it. It was warm enough to make the frozen afternoon seem almost like spring. He watched his children chase the little wooden ball before quietly saying, almost to himself, "They have not played like this in a very long time." Amelia followed the pups with her eyes. Sometimes children only need to know someone is nearby. Ethan slowly turned toward her. Those simple words landed more heavily than any speech delivered inside his royal court. He had spent years believing protection meant strong walls, loyal guards, and careful planning. Yet standing before him was a woman whose tiny cabin held none of those things. And somehow it had become the safest place his children had ever known. The smallest pup suddenly returned, pressing its little body against Amelia before looking back toward Ethan. Then it gently took one careful step forward, inviting them both to follow. Ethan lowered his gaze to the tiny white wolf, and a quiet realization settled into his heart. His children had not simply been rescued. They had found someone they already trusted enough to lead them home together. The playful afternoon slowly settled into a peaceful silence as long shadows stretched across the clearing. The little wolves wandered happily between Ethan and Amelia, never choosing one over the other, as though they had already decided there was room for both inside their tiny hearts. Amelia knelt beside the smallest pup, gently brushing loose snow from its soft fur, while Ethan watched with thoughtful eyes. He had seen countless people bow before a crown, eager to earn favor or reward. None of them had ever looked at his children the way this quiet Omega did. She never saw royal heirs. She only saw three little souls who deserved comfort. The sound of hurried footsteps suddenly broke the stillness. Captain Brooks approached the edge of the clearing with 6 palace guards following behind him. They stopped several yards away exactly as Ethan had ordered, but one young guard, barely older than 20, glanced toward the pups with visible relief and took an instinctive step forward. "Your Majesty, we should return the young heirs to the palace before nightfall," he said respectfully. Before anyone else could move, the 3 little wolves reacted together. The largest pup quietly walked in front of Amelia. The second stood beside its sibling, ears lifted and body straight. The smallest hurried behind Amelia's boots, peeking around her skirt while refusing to leave her side. None of them growled. None of them showed fear. They simply placed themselves between Amelia and every unfamiliar face. The young guard immediately stopped walking. Surprise spread across every soldier's expression. Captain Brooks had served the royal family long enough to recognize what he was witnessing. The heirs were protecting someone. Amelia looked down at the tiny wolves with gentle confusion. She slowly rested one reassuring hand upon the largest pup's head. "It is all right," she whispered softly. "No one here wants to hurt anyone." The little wolves looked up at her, but remained exactly where they were. Ethan noticed something remarkable. They trusted Amelia's voice enough to relax, yet they still refused to move away from her. Loyalty had become instinct in only one day. Ethan stepped forward alone, leaving the guards where they stood. The pups looked toward him immediately. He lowered himself until he was kneeling at their eye level, his movements slow and patient. "You did well," he said quietly. "You stayed together." The largest pup wagged its tail once before looking back toward Amelia, as though asking whether everything remained safe. Ethan followed that tiny glance. Even now, his children measured the world through her presence. Amelia smiled gently, still unaware of the enormous meaning behind their behavior. "They have been looking after one another since yesterday," she explained. "The smallest one likes to stay close, but the other 2 always make sure nobody gets left behind." Ethan's eyes softened. "Yes," he answered. "They learned that from their mother." For a brief moment, sadness quietly crossed his face before disappearing beneath calm composure. Amelia noticed the change without asking questions. Instead, she simply said, "She must have loved them very much." Ethan looked toward the three little wolves playing around Amelia's boots. "She did." His voice carried gratitude instead of grief. "She taught them that strength begins with kindness." Amelia smiled. "Then she taught them well." Captain Brooks lowered his head respectfully. Even he had never heard the Alpha King speak so openly about the past. The smallest pup suddenly tugged at Amelia's sleeve with tiny, careful teeth before leading her toward the porch. The other two immediately followed. Curious, Ethan walked behind them. When Amelia reached the rocking chair beside the cabin door, she sat down naturally, and within seconds the three little wolves climbed onto the blanket spread across her lap and around her feet, as though repeating the same peaceful routine they had shared all morning. One rested against her shoulder. Another curled beside her hand. The smallest nestled comfortably against her knees before closing its eyes with complete trust. Ethan stood motionless. No command had been spoken. No training had been given. His children had simply chosen the place where they felt safest. The palace guards watched in complete silence. None of them had ever seen the energetic young heirs become so peaceful so quickly. Captain Brooks quietly smiled to himself. "Your Majesty," he said softly, "they have accepted her." Ethan never took his eyes off the gentle scene before him. "No," he answered after a long, thoughtful pause. "They accepted her yesterday." His gaze rested upon Amelia, who absent-mindedly stroked the smallest pup's ears while humming a quiet melody she had known since childhood. She did not realize every little wolf had already fallen asleep again beneath the simple song. Ethan finally understood why the tiny paw prints had never turned back toward the palace. His children had not wandered away searching for adventure. Without knowing it, they had followed the scent of the one place where their hearts could finally rest. The sun slipped lower behind the towering pines, painting the snow with shades of gold and pale amber as a quiet peace settled across the clearing. Amelia remained seated on the old rocking chair, careful not to disturb the three sleeping pups curled comfortably against her. Their tiny breaths rose in soft white clouds whenever the cold breeze drifted across the porch before disappearing into the warmth surrounding them. Ethan stood only a few steps away, watching the gentle scene with thoughtful silence. He had delayed returning to the palace longer than anyone would have expected, yet for the first time in many months, urgency no longer seemed stronger than patience. One of the palace guards quietly approached Captain Brooks, carrying a folded wool cloak around his arm. "The temperature is dropping quickly," the young guard whispered. "Should we prepare to leave?" Before Captain Brooks could answer, an elderly woman slowly emerged from the forest path leading toward the clearing. She leaned upon a polished ash walking stick, her silver hair braided neatly beneath a dark hood trimmed with white fur. Every guard immediately recognized her. It was Evelyn Ashcroft, the palace healer who had served 3 generations of the royal family and whose wisdom was respected throughout every northern territory. Ethan inclined his head respectfully. "You came yourself." Evelyn smiled gently. "When I heard where I might find the young heirs, I believed my old legs could still carry me one more mile." She stepped quietly onto the porch, stopping several feet away from Amelia. The elderly healer said nothing at first. Instead, she simply observed. Her kind eyes rested upon the smallest pup sleeping with one tiny paw wrapped around Amelia's sleeve. The second lay comfortably across her lap, while the largest remained stretched protectively beside her boots, even while asleep. Evelyn's expression slowly softened into something remarkably close to wonder. Amelia looked up politely. "Good afternoon." Evelyn returned the smile. "Good afternoon, my dear." Amelia carefully adjusted the blanket covering the pups. "I hope you do not mind that they have made themselves at home." Evelyn quietly laughed. "From what I can see, they chose the right home." Ethan noticed the unusual warmth in the old healer's voice. Throughout her long life, Evelyn rarely spoke carelessly. Every observation carried quiet purpose. She slowly stepped closer before gently kneeling beside the smallest pup. Her weathered hand hovered only inches above its head without touching. She closed her eyes for one silent moment. When she opened them again, she looked directly toward Ethan. "Their hearts are peaceful," she said softly. Ethan nodded. "I can see that." Evelyn slowly turned toward Amelia. "May I ask you something?" Amelia smiled. Of course. When they arrived yesterday, were they frightened? Amelia thought for a moment before answering. Only at first. She gently stroked the smallest pup's soft fur. After they had something warm to eat and a place to rest, they relaxed very quickly. Evelyn listened carefully. Did they trust you immediately? Amelia shook her head. No. She smiled at the memory. The smallest one watched me for almost an hour before coming closer. The others waited until it felt safe. Evelyn nodded thoughtfully. Very wise little wolves. Ethan quietly folded his arms, sensing the healer was reaching a conclusion. Evelyn slowly rose to her feet before speaking again. Many people believe children follow strength because it makes them feel protected. She looked toward the 3 sleeping pups. They are mistaken. Amelia tilted her head with quiet curiosity. Evelyn smiled gently. Children follow peace. They stay where their hearts stop searching. The words settled across the clearing like falling snow. Ethan lowered his eyes toward his sleeping children. He remembered restless nights inside the palace when the youngest often woke, crying for reasons no physician could explain. He remembered endless attempts to comfort them with larger rooms, finer blankets, new toys, and additional attendants. Nothing had ever brought the quiet he now witnessed inside one simple afternoon. Amelia looked at the tiny wolves with tender affection. They have been very easy to love. She spoke the sentence so naturally that she hardly noticed saying it aloud. Ethan heard every word. So did Captain Brooks. Even the palace guards quietly looked away, suddenly understanding why the Alpha King had remained in the clearing instead of ordering an immediate return. Evelyn stepped closer to Amelia and gently touched her shoulder. Kindness leaves a scent that cannot be seen, she said softly. Some hearts recognize it long before the mind understands why. Amelia smiled with quiet embarrassment. I only did what anyone should do. Evelyn's eyes sparkled kindly. Perhaps. She glanced toward Ethan. But not everyone does. The smallest pup stirred in its sleep before reaching one tiny paw toward Amelia's hand. Without opening her eyes, Amelia instinctively held it. The little wolf immediately relaxed again, breathing peacefully beneath the fading winter light. Ethan watched the tiny gesture in complete silence. No ceremony had declared this bond. No ancient law had created it. It had grown from warm soup, gentle hands, patient words, and one lonely cabin where compassion had quietly become stronger than fear. And for the first time since becoming Alpha King, Ethan began to wonder whether the future of his family had arrived wearing neither a crown nor a title, but carrying nothing more than an ordinary heart that refused to turn away from those who needed it most. As twilight gently settled over the forest, Ethan looked toward the narrow road leading back to Blackwood Palace, then back to the little cabin glowing with warm firelight. The decision before him should have been simple. The heirs belonged inside the safest fortress in the Northern Territories. Every royal duty demanded that they return immediately. Yet the 3 little wolves still rested peacefully around Amelia, and no part of him wished to disturb the quiet they had found. Captain Brooks stepped closer, lowering his voice. Your Majesty, night will arrive within the hour. Ethan nodded slowly before turning toward Amelia. Would you allow me to ask something of you? Amelia looked up with gentle curiosity. Of course. Ethan hesitated for the briefest moment, choosing his words carefully. Would you come to the palace with us for a few days? Amelia blinked in surprise. Me? Only until they settle back into their routine. Amelia lowered her eyes to the little wolves curled against the blanket. If they truly need me, I will help. She paused before adding honestly. But I have never been inside a palace. Ethan's expression softened into the faintest smile. Neither had I once. Amelia laughed quietly, and even Captain Brooks could not hide a small smile of his own. The largest pup suddenly lifted its head, as though sensing the conversation concerned them. It looked from Ethan to Amelia before gently nudging her hand with its nose. The second stretched lazily, while the smallest climbed into her lap once again, refusing to move. Evelyn watched the moment unfold with knowing eyes. Perhaps we should let them decide, she suggested gently. Ethan looked toward her. How? The elderly healer smiled. Children often answer questions more honestly than adults. Amelia carefully stood, still holding the smallest pup in her arms. Ethan knelt several feet away and opened his hands toward the 3 little wolves. Come, he said warmly. The largest pup immediately trotted toward him, happily brushing against his knee. The second followed only moments later before sitting proudly beside its father. Ethan smiled with quiet relief as he gently scratched behind both little ears. Then all three adults looked toward the smallest. It took 3 careful steps toward Ethan before stopping halfway between them. It looked back at Amelia. Then it looked toward Ethan again. Finally, with complete confidence, it turned around, trotted back to Amelia, gently caught the edge of her sleeve between tiny teeth, and tugged softly before walking toward Ethan once more. Amelia looked down in surprise. "I think," she whispered. Evelyn smiled warmly. "Yes." Amelia followed the little wolf until she stood beside Ethan. The smallest pup immediately settled between them with obvious satisfaction before curling into the snow at their feet as though the problem had now been solved. Captain Brooks quietly laughed under his breath. "Very clever." Ethan looked down at the tiny white wolf before meeting Amelia's eyes. "Apparently, I have been given my answer." Amelia smiled, unable to hide the warmth spreading across her face. "It seems you have." The other 2 pups quickly joined their youngest sibling, happily circling both adults before sitting together with wagging tails. To every guard watching from the edge of the clearing, the meaning became impossible to miss. The little wolves had not chosen one person over another. They had chosen togetherness. Evelyn folded her hands with quiet satisfaction. "Sometimes," she said softly, "the smallest hearts carry the greatest wisdom." Ethan slowly rose to his full height before offering Amelia a respectful nod instead of a royal command. "Will you honor my family by accepting our invitation?" Amelia looked once toward her little cabin. The simple garden slept beneath fresh snow. The bird feeder still hung beside the porch. Smoke continued drifting peacefully from the chimney. It had been her entire world for many quiet years. Then she looked down at the 3 little wolves waiting hopefully between them. Her answer came from the same place every kind decision in her life had always begun. "Yes," she said gently. "I will come." The smallest pup bounced happily through the snow while the other 2 followed with excited little barks. Even the palace guard smiled openly now. Captain Brooks quietly ordered a carriage to be brought from the forest road, but Ethan raised one hand before anyone moved. "No carriage." The captain looked surprised. Ethan glanced toward Amelia's modest porch. "We will walk together." Snowflakes began drifting gently from the evening sky as Ethan, Amelia, and the 3 joyful little wolves started down the narrow forest path side by side. Behind them, the tiny cabin remained glowing softly beneath the winter stars, and ahead of them, the lights of Blackwood Palace slowly appeared beyond the distant trees. For the first time in a very long while, the road home no longer belonged to a king returning with his heirs. It belonged to a family taking its very first steps toward becoming whole again. The palace gates opened slowly beneath a sky filled with quiet stars, and warm golden lights spilled across the snow as Ethan, Amelia, and the 3 little wolves crossed into Blackwood Palace together. Servants lined the entrance hall, their expressions shifting from relief to complete astonishment. The young heirs, who usually raced through the marble corridors without slowing for anyone, remained close to Amelia, happily weaving around her steps as though they had always belonged beside her. Some of the older servants exchanged silent smiles. Others quietly wiped tears from their eyes. They had not seen the children this peaceful since the passing of their mother. Amelia hesitated as she stepped onto the pole. Amelia looked at him with quiet. Amelia appeared only moments later, carrying nothing more than the small satchel she had brought from her cabin. The pups happily rushed toward her again, each brushing gently against her legs before continuing inside. A few council members exchanged puzzled glances. One elderly noble finally spoke. "Your Majesty, who is this woman?" Ethan remained perfectly calm. "Her name is Amelia Brooks." The noble bowed politely before asking another careful question. "Has she been appointed as a royal caretaker?" Ethan looked toward Amelia, who was kneeling to straighten one of the blue ribbons that had become slightly loose around the smallest pup's neck. He answered without hesitation. "No title is needed to recognize kindness." Silence settled across the hall. No one challenged him. At that very moment, the smallest pup wandered toward the enormous royal fireplace before stopping and looking around uncertainly. The room felt too large, too unfamiliar. Amelia quietly walked over, spread a folded blanket near the warmth of the fire, and sat beside it without saying a single word. Within seconds, The smallest pup curled into her lap. The second followed. The largest stretched across the edge of the blanket exactly as it had done inside the little cabin, keeping gentle watch over its siblings before finally closing its own eyes. The great hall, usually filled with formal conversation and official business, became completely still. Every noble, servant, and guard witnessed the same impossible truth. The heirs had found peace not because of royal comfort, but because one ordinary woman had carried it into the palace with her. Ethan slowly crossed the room until he stood beside Amelia. He looked down at his sleeping children for a long moment before quietly kneeling on one knee beside the blanket. The movement surprised everyone present. Kings were bowed to. They did not kneel. Amelia looked up with gentle confusion. Ethan met her eyes, and for the first time since they had met in the snowy clearing, he allowed every wall around his heart to fall away. For many years, he said softly, I believe protecting my family meant building stronger walls, commanding more guards, and carrying every burden alone. He glanced toward the peaceful little wolves. I was wrong. Amelia listened without speaking. Ethan smiled gently at the sleeping children. You gave them something this kingdom could not buy. Amelia lowered her eyes modestly. I only gave them what I had. Ethan nodded. Exactly. His voice remained calm, but every person in the hall heard the quiet truth within it. Sometimes what the heart needs most comes from someone who believes what they have is ordinary. The smallest pup stretched in its sleep before placing one tiny paw across Amelia's hand and another against Ethan's knee. The little gesture made both adults smile at the same time. Evelyn Ashcroft quietly stepped forward from the back of the hall. Your Majesty, she said warmly. It seems the young ones have already decided what home feels like. Ethan looked toward the elderly healer before returning his gaze to Amelia. Then I should listen to the wisest members of my family. Soft laughter rippled through the room, easing every remaining trace of formality. Outside, fresh snow began falling once more, covering the palace gardens with a quiet blanket of white. Inside, the fire burned steadily while three little wolves slept without worry between the father who had searched every mile to find them and the woman who had loved them before she knew their names. Ethan looked toward the windows where the snow drifted gently beneath the moonlight, then back toward the peaceful family gathered around the fire. His kingdom had been built through courage. His throne had been secured through sacrifice. But neither victory had ever filled the empty places inside his home. Tonight, surrounded not by power but by simple kindness, he finally understood that the strongest foundation any family could stand upon was never fear, wealth, or titles. It was the quiet certainty that whenever the world became cold, there would always be someone waiting with a warm fire, an open heart, and a place where every wandering soul could finally rest.